Welcome to today's Explainer. We're tracking a massive wave of global shifts right now to understand how the world is fundamentally realigning. From the highest levels of the global tech race, literally all the way down to the drive-through window at your local fast food joint, the landscape is shifting rapidly beneath our feet. We're going to break down the most crucial changes happening right now, using the data and direct reporting to show you exactly what is going on. Here's the agenda for today. 1. Tech stocks and AI rivalry. 2. Political friction and voting laws. 3. Hidden bond market risks. 4. Real estate and restructuring. And 5. Fast food and culture. Let's dive right in. Section 1. Tech stocks and AI rivalry. So, our first stop is the technology desk, where foreign advances are absolutely hammering the U.S. stock market. If you've been glancing at your portfolio this week, you definitely felt this firsthand. We just saw a brutal sell-off. The PHLX Semiconductor Index, which is packed with industry heavyweights, plummeted 10% this week. That is a crash right into bear market territory, marking its steepest weekly drop since April 2025. The Nasdaq slid 2.9%, and the S&P 500 fell 1.6%. Now, you might be asking, what actually triggered this massive unwinding? Well, it all stems from a surprise out of Beijing. Here's the crucial detail. A Beijing-based startup called Moonshot AI released a brand new model called Kimi K3. And Kimi K3 debuted as the world's largest open source or open weight model, meaning it's totally free to download, it's cheaper to use, and it's highly customizable. But here is the real kicker. It actually outperforms proprietary American models like Anthropic's Opus 4.8 and OpenAI's GPT 5.5 in coding benchmarks. Now, coding is a massive deal, right? It's basically the ultimate benchmark proving an AI can autonomously complete really complex tasks. So having this highly capable free model suddenly available is a direct threat to the massive capital spending and the sheer computing demand that's been powering the US tech economy and justifying those lofty chip stock valuations. And, the geopolitical stakes here are massive. Shortly after Kimi K3 dropped, Chinese leader Xi Jinping explicitly endorsed this open-source approach during a speech in Shanghai. He is openly touting this as the precise strategy to help China catch up with and ultimately challenge U.S. national security tech advantages. Make no mistake, this is a very direct response to U.S. efforts to protect its lead in AI semiconductors. Moving on to Section 2, Political Friction and Voting Laws. Pivoting from tech rivalries over to domestic policy, the political landscape is also undergoing a major realignment as we barrel toward the midterms. Against the advice of some of his aides, who really wanted him to focus on the economy for midterm messaging, President Trump delivered a roughly 25-minute primetime address from the White House. The main focus? He leaned heavily into allegations of Chinese interference in the 2020 election, stating that Beijing was involved in election meddling. To keep our lens totally neutral here, we have to look at the direct response. The Chinese Foreign Ministry firmly denied these allegations, basically stating that the claims have absolutely zero factual ground. They also issued a warning, saying these types of allegations could erode the already very uneasy détente between the two nations, a relationship that's obviously already strained by trade and the exact tech competition we just talked about. Meanwhile, it's worth noting that U.S. intelligence previously assessed that while Beijing did consider an influence campaign back in 2020, they ultimately chose not to deploy it. Domestically, though, President Trump is using these claims to actively pressure Congress to pass the Save America Act. This is a piece of legislation that would fundamentally rewrite federal voting requirements literally overnight. It demands an approved voter ID and mandatory proof of citizenship to register, meaning a passport or a birth certificate, and an expanded version being pushed heavily by the president would go even further, banning most mail-in voting and imposing brand new legal liabilities for election officials. As you can imagine, this has sparked intense debate on both sides of the aisle. Democrats argue this legislation will end up discouraging millions of legitimate voters who just don't have ready access to a passport or birth certificate. But what's really interesting is that even some Republicans who actually strongly support the core ID rules are pushing back. Why? Because they fear a total ban on mail-in voting could actually hurt their own voter turnout this November, and they're really worried about the sheer logistics of implementing such massive rule changes this close to an election. All right, Section 3, Hidden Bond Market Risks. Let's shift gears to the economy and look at how structural deficits are quietly shaking the foundations of the U.S. bond market. Now, this is one of those highly complex, wonky areas that rarely hits the front page, but it affects absolutely everything. Before we get into the data, we need a quick refresher on repo loans. Basically, these are short-term bank loans collateralized by bonds. And why does this matter right now? Because opportunistic hedge funds are heavily relying on these exact repo loans to finance massive bond buying operations. They aren't necessarily betting on which way yields will go, they're doing arbitrage. They're scooping up tiny profits on massive volumes using borrowed bank money. Now, what's honestly a bit terrifying when you look at the numbers is the massive drop in stable, quote-unquote, price-insensitive owners. Think back to 2007. Central banks, sovereign wealth funds, and commercial banks owned 75% of all outstanding treasury debt. Fast forward to today, that number has plummeted to just 52%. So who's filling that huge void? Fast-moving, price-sensitive investors. Hedge funds alone have seen their share jump up to 8.5%. We're watching the market's entire foundation shift from patient, long-term money to highly leveraged, opportunistic money. And they're doing all this while the U.S. government is facing a gargantuan borrowing need, $2 trillion. That is the amount of additional debt the U.S. literally has to issue annually right now during a peacetime deficit. With the traditional stable buyers stepping back, the Treasury is effectively being forced to rely heavily on those potentially fragile hedge fund buyers we just mentioned. Which leaves us with a massive cliffhanger. The Bank for International Settlements is out there warning that just a tiny handful of dealers account for the bulk of this repo lending. If any stress hits the banks and those loans suddenly dry up, hedge funds are going to be forced to liquidate their treasuries en masse. So if this fragile system breaks, kind of like it did back in March 2020, will the Federal Reserve have to step in and buy bonds just to save the government's borrowing capacity? Because if they do, they compromise their own independence, crossing the line into what economists call fiscal dominance. Moving to Section 4, Real Estate and Restructuring. Next up, we're looking at how deep demographic and financial realities are totally forcing realignments in both housing and our most legendary institutions. Simply put, the old rules just don't apply anymore. Take retirement housing. Defying literally all traditional logic, where you're supposed to downsize to save money, a lot of well-off boomers are actually upsizing. Take Angela and Victor Martino, for instance. They just moved out of a 2,000 square foot ranch into a massive 5,000 square foot house right next door in California. We're talking a commercial meat slicer in the kitchen for big family events and concrete floors specifically for the grandkids. They are completely rewriting the rules of what aging in place actually looks like. Meanwhile, the financial reality over at America's wealthiest university is completely different. Harvard University is currently kicking off one of its largest reorganizations in years, all because they are staring down a crushing $365 million structural deficit. It's a massive overhaul that is forcing hundreds of staff cuts and role changes all across the university. So how exactly does a university with an endowment that size end up in the red? Well, former Fed Governor Jeremy Stein actually called the school a battleship with a lot of barnacles. See, for years, Harvard operated on a highly decentralized every tub on its own bottom accounting system, which essentially hid these underlying issues. The deficit really stems from a massive campus expansion back in the 2000s. Huge headcount growth, it apparently takes 67 steps just to hire a staff member there, and a massive miscalculation of building repairs. Standard accounting said their depreciation was $138 million, but the reality is closer to $400 million a year just to maintain their historic aging buildings. Add in new endowment tax hikes on top of all that, and, well, the math finally broke. And finally, Section 5, Fast Food and Culture. For our final desk, we're looking at dominant cultural brands. We've talked about global AI wars, trillion-dollar federal deficits, and Ivy League restructuring. But sometimes the biggest realignment comes from a microscopic threat, right to our daily routines. Right now, an outbreak of a rare parasite called cyclosporiasis has completely derailed Taco Bell's incredibly successful 6-year winning streak. Federal health officials have linked the parasite directly to shredded iceberg lettuce, and it has already sickened over 1,600 customers across Michigan, Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky, and West Virginia. So why is this lettuce crisis so incredibly dangerous for the corporate bottom line? Because Taco Bell has basically been single-handedly defying fast food fatigue. They've been partnering with artists like Doja Cat, launching these hugely popular Luxe boxes, and seeing a massive 6.5% weekly sales increase just since April. But parent company Yum Brands is desperately relying on Taco Bell's cultural cool factor to carry the whole corporation. They're actually in the middle of offloading struggling assets like Pizza Hut, which makes Taco Bell responsible for more than 25% of their total system-wide sales. If consumers lose trust over food safety right now, Yum Brands is facing a massive, measurable headwind. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder. From microscopic parasites threatening our food supply, to open source code threatening Silicon Valley, to highly leveraged hedge funds quietly propping up the US government's debt, everything is connected and everything is shifting. Keep these massive realignments in mind as you watch the headlines unfold over the months ahead. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive, and keep questioning how all these pieces fit together.